The day the lawyer read my inheritance, the whole room laughed. Not polite laughter, not the quiet kind people hide behind their hands. This was the full, ugly, head-thrown-back kind, the laughter of people who had been waiting to see someone like me fail and had finally gotten exactly what they wanted. The probate room in Broken Bow was small and cold, with mud tracked across the floor and two men on benches waiting on their own deeds. They weren't laughing at their business. They were laughing at mine. When the clerk read aloud the words, 12 acres of improved earth shelter and winter yard, one of them slapped his knee so hard the sound echoed off the walls. Gideon Thiel, a freight hauler who had been leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, smiled like a man counting money he hadn't yet stolen. And Mrs. Hester Vane, the matron of Mercy House, who had come to witness the reading as if my humiliation required official supervision, stood in the corner with her steel gray bun pulled so tight it lifted her eyebrows. When the laughter finally died down, she folded her hands, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Well, Nettie, even the dead can leave a girl one final humiliation." I was 17 years old. I'd been a widow for 3 months, married for 11 before that, and an orphan for the 9 years before that. My father died under a freight wagon outside Kearney when I was 8. Crushed ribs, they said, though I never saw the body. My mother followed 2 winters later, childbed fever, and took my infant brother with her the same night. After that, I became something to be passed around. 4 months with Uncle Reuben, who wanted free kitchen work, but not another mouth. 7 months with the Tanners, who sent me away after I corrected their son's sums. 9 months at the Mercy House dormitory in Broken Bow, where Mrs. Vane treated my habit of reading after lamp out like a form of theft. And then Eli Bell, a homesteader with a cough and kind eyes who married me at 16 and died 11 months later, leaving me exactly where I had started, alone, unwanted, and carrying everything I owned in a single suitcase. I had $2.14 in my pocket. I had 1 wool dress fit for Sunday and 1 plain dress fit for work. I had Eli's knife and a wagon with a wheel that pulled left. And now, according to the paper in the clerk's hands, I had Bell's burrow. That's what everyone called it. The burrow. 12 acres of land so worthless that Eli's great-aunt had bought it 30 years earlier for $9 and a broken wagon axle. The deed described it as improved earth shelter and winter yard. But the men in that probate room knew what it really was. A half-collapsed dugout built into the side of a hill, with a cracked south wall and a stovepipe that leaned like a drunk, 9 miles from anywhere anyone wanted to be. The woman who had lived there, Eli's great-aunt, a widow herself, had spent her last decades digging ditches and burying boards while the whole county called her crazy. "That woman buried her household goods in the dirt," one of the men on the bench said, still grinning. "Stored her firewood underground like a prairie dog storing nuts. Told people they didn't understand winter." He shook his head. "She died in that hole. Pneumonia. Nobody found her for a week." The room laughed again. Smaller this time, but no kinder. I looked down at the deed in my hands. At the little sketch someone had drawn in the margin, a narrow line running from a small square to a larger rectangle, a trench connected to a cabin floor, and 2 words written beside it in faded ink. Winter yard. Something flickered in my chest. Not hope. I'd learned better than to feel hope. But something, a heat I couldn't name, rising up from somewhere I'd forgotten existed. I looked at Mrs. Vane. I looked at Gideon Thiel. I looked at the 2 men on the bench who were still shaking their heads at the thought of a woman burying boards. And I decided, standing there in that cold probate room with mud on the floor and laughter still hanging in the air, that I would go to Bell's burrow, that I would find out what that dead woman had been building in the dirt, and that I would never give any of these people the satisfaction of watching me crawl back. If you want to find out what I discovered in that hole in the ground, how a 17-year-old widow with $2 to her name turned a dirt-covered embarrassment into something that saved an entire valley when the worst winter in Nebraska history tried to freeze us all to death, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. 'Cause what that woman buried in the frozen Nebraska prairie, what I dug up and rebuilt with my own bleeding hands, is a story that's still keeping people warm today. I left Broken Bow 4 days later. Mrs. Vane didn't try to stop me. I think she was glad to see me go, because every time I passed her in the hall, she had to remember the sound of her own laughter in that probate room. The road out of town was decent for the first 3 miles, where farmers kept it passable for their wagons. Then it turned to ruts. Then the ruts gave way to grass, and the grass gave way to nothing but the faint impression of wheels that had come this way before and never bothered to come back. My wagon pulled left the whole way, that bad wheel grinding like it wanted to argue with every decision I'd ever made. The sky was the color of dirty dishwater. November in Nebraska looks like God forgot to finish painting. I'd been told the place was 9 miles north of Juniper Crossing, which put it roughly 12 miles from Broken Bow. By mile 8, I understood why Eli had never taken me out here. The land didn't want visitors. The grass got shorter and meaner, the rises steeper, and the wind came at me sideways like it had personal business with my face. I passed one farmstead with smoke coming from the chimney, and the woman who came to the door just stared at me until I was out of sight. She didn't wave. Nobody waved out here. I found Bell's Burrow by accident because I'd been looking for a house. What I found instead was a hump in the earth, with a stovepipe sticking out of it at an angle that suggested the whole thing was about to give up and lie down. The south wall had cracked open in a long diagonal line, like the hill had tried to swallow the structure and then changed its mind. One window was stuffed with flour sacking gone yellow and stiff. The lean-to beside it had already collapsed, just a pile of gray boards and old sod. And running from the foundation into the hillside was a long, shallow depression, maybe 30 feet, choked with tumbleweed and frozen clods of dirt. The famous trench. It looked like a grave that couldn't decide how long to be. I sat in the wagon for a long time. The mule didn't move. I didn't move. The wind moved plenty for all of us. This was my inheritance. This was what had made a whole room full of grown men laugh until they had to wipe their eyes. I understood the joke now. I was the punchline. But I had nowhere else to go. That's the thing about having nothing. It simplifies your choices considerably. I climbed down from the wagon, walked to the door, and pushed. It didn't open. I pushed harder. Something inside scraped against the floor, and the door gave about 8 inches, enough for me to squeeze through sideways. The smell hit me first. Old ash, mouse droppings, damp earth, and something else underneath. Not rot exactly, but the smell of a place that had been holding its breath for a long time. The light came in gray and thin through the flour sack window. I could see a plank floor, warped but intact, a small iron stove with its door hanging open, a shelf along one wall with a few tin cans and a cracked bowl, and a narrow bed frame with no mattress, just rope webbing gone slack in the middle. The cabin was maybe 12 feet by 14, a coffin with better ventilation. I spent that first afternoon just making the place survivable. I cleared the mouse nests from the stove, checked the pipe for blockage, found a half-cord of old wood behind the collapsed lean-to that was still dry enough to burn, and got a fire going before dark. The smoke backed up twice before I figured out the damper was rusted nearly shut. By the time I had heat, my hands were black with soot, and my eyes burned from crying or from smoke, I told myself. Just the smoke. That first night I slept on the floor beside the stove, wrapped in Eli's old coat and my one wool blanket, listening to the wind find every crack in the walls and tell me about them in detail. I dreamed about the probate room. I dreamed about laughter. The second day I explored. The cabin had been built into the hillside, so the back wall was solid earth, packed and stable. The side walls were a combination of sod blocks and salvaged lumber, with the south wall, the one that had cracked, taking the worst of the weather. The floor was planks laid over packed earth, uneven but solid. In the corner by the stove, I noticed one plank that sat slightly higher than the others, its edges worn smooth. I didn't think much of it then. The shelf held more than I'd first noticed. Behind the tin cans was a flour bin, old and dry, with the lid stuck tight. I pried it open expecting weevils or nothing. What I found instead was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth tied with twine that had gone brittle with age. I carried it to the window where the light was better. The oilcloth was stiff and cracked, but underneath were 11 stitched account books, the kind you'd buy at a general store for keeping figures. The covers were faded, but the pages inside were covered in small, careful handwriting, the same handwriting that had appeared in the margin of my deed, that little sketch of a trench running to a cabin floor. I opened the first book and read the date at the top of the page, March 1859. Eliza Crow Bell had started writing 26 years before she died. I didn't read much that second night. I was too tired, too cold, too busy keeping the fire going and rationing the last of the bread I'd brought from town. But I read enough to know that these weren't ordinary accounts. There were no lists of purchases, no household budgets. Instead, the pages were filled with observations, temperatures, measurements, questions. Frost depth at north corner, 14 inches, south exposure, 9 inches. Why the difference? Soil composition or simply sun angle? Stored potatoes in shallow pit covered with straw only. Checked after first hard freeze. Loss of 60% to rot and frost damage. Must go deeper. Must insulate better. The wind is not the enemy. The wind is a symptom. The enemy is exposure. I closed the book and sat with it in my lap, staring at the fire. Outside, the wind was doing exactly what Eliza had described, finding every weak point, every gap, every place where the inside met the outside, and turning it into a weapon. She had been watching this land for 26 years. She had been asking questions about it, measuring it, fighting it, and everyone in Juniper Crossing had called her crazy. I thought about Mrs. Vane's face when she delivered her line in probate. Even the dead can leave a girl one final humiliation. I thought about the men laughing. I thought about Gideon Thale leaning in the doorway with that satisfied look, like he was already counting the weeks until I'd give up and he could buy the place for back taxes. And I thought about Eliza Crow Bell, alone in this hump of earth, writing down the temperature of the soil while people in town told stories about the crazy woman in the burrow. I opened the book again. The third night I started reading in earnest. I rationed the lamp oil, keeping the wick low, but I couldn't stop. Book 1 covered Eliza's first 3 years on the claim, failure after failure after failure. She tried root cellars that flooded. She tried above-ground storage that froze. She tried burying potatoes, burying turnips, burying seed grain, and watching most of it rot or freeze or get dug up by animals. But she kept writing. She kept measuring. And slowly, across books 2, 3, and 4, a pattern emerged. The deeper you go, the more stable the temperature. The earth is a blanket, but a blanket that holds water is worse than no blanket at all. The question is, how deep and how dry? By book 5, she had started testing wood storage. This is where my breath caught. Wood on open rack after sleet, lost. 3 days of freezing rain, and the pile was solid ice. Broke 2 axe handles trying to free it. Burned chair legs that week. Wood under canvas, better, but canvas tore in the wind and let ice in anyway. Lost half the pile. Wood in shallow trench, covered with planks only, dry enough to burn, but hard to access in deep snow. Had to shovel for an hour to reach the hatch. Nearly frostbit my hands. And then, in book 6, wood in deep trench, covered with planks and sod, with drainage slope and interior access through floor, dry, accessible, burns clean. 3 weeks of the worst weather I have seen in 19 years, and I pulled kindling from my own floor every morning like I was reaching into a cupboard. She had done it. She had figured it out, and she had kept writing for 3 more books, refining the system, fixing the drainage, deepening the trench, extending the length, noting every failure and adjustment and hard-won inch of improvement. Book 11 was different from the others. It was half empty, and what was written there wasn't measurements or observations. It was letters. Letters she'd never sent, or maybe copies of letters she had sent and gotten no answer to. To the matron of Mercy House, Broken Bow, Nebraska Territory, I am writing to inquire whether you might have among your charges a young woman with an inclination toward figures, measurement, or natural observation. I am a widow of 61 years with a working homestead and considerable practical knowledge to share. I am prepared to offer room, board, and instruction in exchange for help with the physical labor I can no longer manage alone. I am particularly interested in a girl who reads. Yours respectfully, Eliza Crow Bell. There were 4 copies of essentially the same letter, dated months apart. None of them had been answered, and at the very end of Book 11, on the last page with writing, was a note that began, "To the first stubborn girl who comes after me." I read it once, then I read it again. Then I pressed the book to my chest and cried, not from sadness, from recognition, from the overwhelming shock of discovering that someone had been waiting for me before I even existed, to the first stubborn girl who comes after me. If you are reading this, I am dead, and you have inherited something the world calls worthless. The world is wrong, but the world will not tell you so. You will have to prove it yourself. I cannot teach you from the grave, but I can leave you what I learned. The trench works, the system is sound, but it is not complete. I ran out of time. I ran out of strength, and I ran out of help. Winter does not beat you by cold alone. It beats you by taking away your reach. Remember this: when the ice comes and locks everything you own under a shell you cannot break, reach will be worth more than gold. The trench opening has collapsed, but the structure beneath is intact. Start at the cabin wall and dig toward the mouth. You will find boards, sound planks, drainage stones. Rebuild what the weather took. Extend it if you can. And when the first hard freeze comes, fill it to the top. I hope you are stubborn. I hope you are patient. I hope you do not listen when they call you crazy. God keep you. Eliza Crow Bell, November 1884. She had died 3 weeks after writing that note. 3 weeks of pneumonia after hauling wet planks in a sleet storm, trying to repair the trench she hadn't had the strength to maintain. I sat on the floor of her cabin, her words in my hands, and made her a promise. In town that Saturday, buying flour and salt and 1 thin ration of lamp oil with the last of my money, I heard what people really thought of Eliza Bell. Amos Pritchard ran the general store. He was a big man with hands like shovels and a way of looking at you that suggested he was calculating your worth down to the quarter cent. When I set my purchases on the counter, he looked at my face and smiled, not kindly. "You're the Bell widow," he said, "the one they gave the borough to." "Yes, sir." That Eliza was a dirt-counting heathen, spent good money on buried boards instead of a proper barn, told anyone who'd listen that we all misunderstood winter. He shook his head, still smiling. Winter gets understood the same way by everyone who lives through it. Cold is cold. You don't outsmart it with a shovel. I didn't say anything. I just paid for my goods and walked out. But I thought about his words all the way home, the wagon wheel grinding its complaint, the wind cutting across the open grass. Cold is cold. You don't outsmart it. Eliza hadn't tried to outsmart the cold. She'd tried to outsmart the ice. The glaze that could seal a woodpile into an unusable tomb. The drift that could bury an entrance until spring. The wet that could soak kindling into uselessness. She'd understood something that Amos Pritchard, with his warm store and his convenient wood delivery and his never having to wonder if he'd freeze, had never had to learn. Winter beats you by taking away your reach. I was going to finish what she started. December came in mean and stayed that way. I lived on potato soup, wild turnips I'd foraged before the ground hardened, and the diminishing stack of old wood behind the collapsed lean-to. My hands cracked open in the cold. My weight dropped, I don't know how much, but my dress hung looser every week, and my hip bones started to bruise against the floor where I slept. The worst morning was 2 weeks before Christmas. I woke up dizzy, the cabin spinning when I tried to stand. I made it to the door, opened it for air, and nearly fell into the trench because my legs wouldn't hold me. I sat in the doorway, wrapped in Eli's coat, and thought about going back. The Mercy House dormitory had a kitchen. It had food, regular food, every day. I'd have a bed instead of a floor. I'd have walls that didn't crack and let the wind through. I'd have women to talk to, even if they were cruel women, even if they mocked my reading, even if Mrs. Vane looked at me every morning with that expression of patient disappointment. I wouldn't freeze to death in a hole in the ground, alone, with nobody to find my body until spring. I thought about it for a long time. Long enough for my hands to go numb in the cold. Long enough for the sun to move a full hand's width across the sky. Then I went back inside, opened Book 11, and read Eliza's note again. I hope you are stubborn. I hope you are patient. I hope you do not listen when they call you crazy. I closed the book. I put on Eli's gloves, which were too big for me and had holes in 2 fingers, and I went out to the trench mouth to start digging. I don't know how to describe that first week of work except to say it nearly killed me. I don't use those words for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. The trench opening had collapsed inward, filling the first 8 or 10 feet with frozen dirt, old sod, and the tangled skeletons of tumbleweeds that had blown in and died there. I had a spade, one spade, with a handle that had been cracked and wrapped with twine, and I had my hands. I worked in shifts of 20 or 30 minutes, then went inside to warm up before my fingers stopped working entirely. Each shift I cleared maybe 2 feet of debris. Each shift I found something new buried in the mess. A broken board, a rusted hinge, once a leather glove so old it crumbled when I touched it. On the 3rd day, I hit solid planks. They were gray and weathered, but when I knocked on them with my knuckles, they rang out solid and dry. Eliza's trench roof. Still there, still sound, still doing the job she'd built it to do. I cleared another 4 feet that day, and another 6 the day after. The trench was narrower than I'd expected, maybe 3 feet wide, but deeper than it looked from above. When I finally got down inside, standing on the bottom with my head below ground level, I measured with my arm. 4 feet to the surface. Deeper than I was tall if I crouched. The walls were lined with boards set on edge, held in place by wooden cleats driven into the earth. The floor was packed dirt with a slight slope, maybe an inch every 8 feet, just enough to move water toward the far end if any got in. At the outer end, partially blocked by debris, I could see the mouth of a drainage tongue angled down and away. It was crude. It was simple. It was brilliant. And it was collapsed at the outer third, where weather and neglect had finally won. The day I made that discovery, I sat in the trench with my back against the earth wall and looked up at the gray November sky and wondered if I could actually do this. Rebuild what had taken Eliza years to design, extend it, make it work. I was 17 years old. I weighed maybe 90 pounds. I had $2 worth of supplies and a wagon with a bad wheel and no one in 50 miles who would lift a finger to help me. And I had 11 notebooks full of instructions from a woman who had believed for 26 years that someone like me would eventually come. I climbed out of the trench and went back inside to study the diagrams. The next week, I made 2 mistakes that almost ended everything. The first was the drainage. Eliza's notebooks were clear. The trench floor had to slope away from the cabin, and the drainage tongue at the far end had to be kept clear. Standing water will rot your wood and freeze into a block you cannot shift. Drainage is everything. I cleared the debris from the drainage tongue and congratulated myself on following instructions. What I didn't notice was that the slope of the trench had shifted where the walls had collapsed. The dirt I'd dug out and not replaced had changed the grade. The first rain, a cold drizzle that came in the night and froze by morning, showed me my error. A puddle of ice formed at the low point, which was now in the middle of the trench instead of at the mouth. I spent 2 days redigging, regrading, moving frozen dirt with hands that had cracked open and bled into my gloves. The second mistake was the hatch. Eliza's system depended on interior access, being able to reach the trench from inside the cabin when weather made outside access impossible. That was the entire point. That was why she had written interior access through floor and underlined it twice. I had noticed the raised plank near the stove on my first day. I had not, in my exhaustion and hunger, thought to lift it. When I finally did, I found a square hole cut into the cabin floor, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, with a short ladder made of pegged rungs descending into darkness. The ladder led to a landing, and the landing connected to the trench through a low doorway shored up with old timbers. The hatch had been covered by the plank, which fit so snugly that you'd never know it was loose unless you were looking for it. Eliza had engineered it perfectly, a direct line from the cabin floor to the stored wood, accessible even in the worst weather. The only problem was that the connecting passage had partially collapsed. Dirt and old sod had slumped into the landing, blocking the doorway. Another 8 or 10 feet to clear, another week of work I hadn't planned for. I sat on the cabin floor looking down into the dark hole and felt something very close to despair. Then I heard a wagon outside. The man who appeared in my doorway was old, 70 at least, maybe older. He was thin, stooped, with hands like bundles of sticks, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same gray wood as the prairie fence posts. He didn't knock. He just stood there looking at me, then passed me to the open hatch in the floor. "You reopened the trench," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm trying to," I said. He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd suspected. Then he walked past me, uninvited, and crouched at the edge of the hatch, peering down into the darkness. "Eliza's connector passage," he said. "Slumped, hasn't it?" "You knew her?" He stood up, knees cracking, and looked at me with eyes that had seen more winters than I could imagine. "Hauled the first planks for her. 30 years ago, maybe more. Played checkers at her table on Sundays when there wasn't anyone else who'd talk to either of us." He paused. "Name's Silas Doan. I'm the one who built the hatch frame." I didn't know what to say. I was so used to mockery, to dismissal, that kindness felt like a foreign language. Silas walked to the shelf, found Eliza's notebooks where I'd stacked them, and rested his hand on the top one like he was greeting an old friend. "She said someone would come," he said quietly. "Someone who'd read these, someone who'd understand what she was trying to do." He looked at me. "You read them?" "All of them." "You understand them?" "I think so. The drainage, the depth, the temperature buffering, the interior access." I paused. "The part about reach." Silas nodded again, that slow prairie nod that seemed to say more than words. "Your Eliza," he said, "knew the difference between owning wood and being able to reach it. Most folks never learn that difference. They stack their fuel in the open, same as their fathers did, same as their grandfathers. When the ice comes, they act surprised. Every single time. They act surprised." He turned to look at me directly, and for the first time I saw something in his face besides age and weariness. I saw anger. Old anger, banked like coals. "I told her once she should teach people, share what she knew. She said she tried. She said they laughed." He shook his head. "This whole valley is full of people who'd rather freeze than learn from a woman who buried boards." "I want to finish it," I said. "The trench, the system, what she couldn't finish." "Can you dig?" "I've been digging." "Can you fit a plank joint?" "I can learn." Silas studied me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the door. "I've got tools in my cart," he said. "A level, a square, some scrap lumber that might do for shoring. I'm 72 years old and my back won't let me dig for more than an hour at a stretch." He paused at the threshold. "But I can teach you how to make it hold." I followed him outside. His mule was standing in the yard, patient as stone, hitched to a small cart loaded with tools and wood scraps. "Why?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He walked to the cart and started unloading the level, the square, an auger, a hammer with a cracked handle. "Because Eliza asked me to," he said finally. 30 years ago, she asked me to help whoever came after her. I told her nobody would come." He set the tools on the ground and looked up at the gray sky. "I'm glad I was wrong." Silas taught the way he did everything else, slowly, carefully, with long silences between instructions. He didn't explain why a thing had to be done a certain way. He showed me once, watched me try it twice, and only spoke if I was about to ruin something. The first thing he taught me was the slope. 1 inch every 8 feet, he said, crouching in the trench with his level balanced on a board. Not more, not less. More and the water moves too fast, carries dirt with it, undermines your walls. Less and the water pools. Either way you lose. I watched him adjust a drainage stone by fractions, tapping it with the heel of his hand until the bubble in the level centered perfectly. His hand shook with age, but the work was precise. "Eliza figured this out herself?" I asked. "Took her 6 years, 6 winters of failures before she got the grade right." He stood up, wincing. You're getting it in an afternoon. Don't waste the gift. The second thing he taught me was bracing. The trench walls wanted to slump. That was their nature, packed earth returning to loose earth, gravity doing what gravity does. Eliza had fought this with boards set on edge, held in place by horizontal cleats driven into the soil. But where the walls had collapsed, the cleats had rotted or pulled loose. Silas showed me how to cut new cleats from scrap lumber, how to drive them at the right angle, how to set the wallboards tight against the earth so water couldn't seep behind them. Tight is everything, he said. Leave a gap and the freeze-thaw will find it. 1 winter, 2 winters, 3 ice splat, and then your whole wall walks into the trench. His hands were too weak to swing the hammer for long, so I did the driving while he held the boards in place. By the end of the first week, we'd rebraced 40 feet of wall. My shoulders burned. My palms had blistered, burst, and blistered again over the raw skin beneath. But the trench was holding. The third thing he taught me was patience. You want to fill it now, he said one evening, watching me stare at the empty trench like it owed me money. I can see it in your face. You want to throw wood in there and call it done. Winter's coming. Winter's always coming. That's not news. He pulled his coat tighter. But if you fill it before the drainage is right, before the roof is sound, before the hatch connection is clear, you'll have 3 cords of rotting wood you can't reach and can't remove. Better to have half a trench that works than a full one that fails. I hated that he was right. I hated waiting. But I waited. The hatch connection took another 2 weeks. The passage had slumped worse than I'd thought, not just dirt, but old timbers that had cracked and shifted, bringing the ceiling down with them. Silas couldn't fit in the narrow space, so I did the work alone, on my hands and knees, scraping dirt into buckets and hauling them up the ladder one at a time. By the time I broke through to the main trench, my knees were raw, and my back felt like someone had been standing on it. But I could reach from the cabin floor to the trench bottom without going outside. The system worked. Eliza would be proud, Silas said, looking down through the hatch at the clear passage below. I didn't say anything. I just sat on the floor and let myself feel, for one moment, like I had actually accomplished something. That December we finished the roof, new planks over the repaired section, cottonwood poles where planks ran short, and thick prairie sod on top of everything. The sod was the hardest part. Each piece had to be cut from the frozen ground, carried to the trench, and laid grass side down so the roots would knit together and hold. My arms felt like they might fall off. Silas directed from above, too stiff to climb down, pointing out gaps and thin spots. Thicker there. You want at least 8 inches of sod over the planks. 6 won't hold the cold back. I added more sod. Then more. Then more. By Christmas Eve, the trench was done. 32 feet long, 4 feet deep, roofed and insulated and draining properly. Empty, but ready. Silas brought a bottle of something he called medicinal, and we sat by the stove drinking it in small sips. It burned all the way down and left a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the alcohol. I lost my son in the Easter storm of '73, Silas said quietly. It was the first time he'd mentioned family. The weather turned fast. He tried to walk home from the Garrett place, less than 2 miles. They found him in the spring, 50 yards from our door. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. Eliza understood weather the way most people don't, he continued. She understood that it's not the cold that kills you, it's the speed of it, the surprise, the way it takes away your options. He stared into the fire. My boy had options that morning. By afternoon, he had none. The trench gives options, I said. The trench gives reach. He lifted his cup. To Eliza. To Eliza. We drank. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, for once, I felt warm. I filled the trench in January. 3 cords of split cottonwood and scrub oak, hauled from a deadfall grove 6 miles away, cut and stacked in the narrow space until there was barely room to move between the rows. Silas helped where he could, but his cough had gotten worse since Christmas, and some days he couldn't leave his cabin. The work took 3 weeks. By the time I placed the last log, I had lost count of how many trips I'd made, how many blisters had formed and broken, How many times I'd thought about simply giving up and letting the cold take me. But the trench was full. When I closed the hatch and sat on the plank above it, I could feel the presence of all that wood beneath me, dry, accessible, waiting. The first real test came in late February. I woke to a sound I didn't recognize, a soft, continuous hissing, like sand being poured on the roof. When I opened the door, I understood. Freezing rain. It had started sometime in the night, and by dawn it had coated everything. The collapsed lean-to was encased in a shell of clear ice. The wagon, the fence posts, the dead grass, all of it glazed and gleaming in the gray light. The temperature had dropped after the rain stopped, and now everything outside existed under an inch of solid ice. I walked to where my small outdoor woodpile sat, the overflow I hadn't been able to fit in the trench. It was a glacier, a solid, immovable mass of frozen logs. I tried hitting it with the axe. The blade bounced off and nearly took my knee with it. Then I went back inside, lifted the loose floorboard, and reached down into the darkness. My hand found the top log. I pulled it up. It was dry. It was solid. The bark was smooth under my fingers. I carried it to the stove, shaved off kindling with Eli's knife, and watched the flame catch on the first strike. I sat on the floor with that burning log and laughed. Then I cried. Then I just sat there watching the fire, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. I felt powerful. Word spread. I don't know how, I certainly didn't tell anyone, but within a week, people in Juniper Crossing were talking about the widow in Bellsboro who had dry wood while everyone else was chopping ice. The first person who came to see it for herself was Mrs. Hanley, a widow like me who lived 3 miles south. She arrived on a mule that looked almost as old as she was, wrapped in so many shawls she could barely move her arms. "I heard you had wood," she said from my doorway, not asking, stating, "I have some." "How?" I showed her the hatch. I showed her the trench. I let her climb down the ladder and see the rows of dry logs, the lined walls, the drainage slope. She stood in the trench for a long time, not saying anything. When she climbed back up, her eyes were wet. "My husband froze to death in '68, she said. "Tried to chop wood in a storm like this one. Heart gave out." She looked at the hatch like it was a miracle. "If we'd had something like this." "Eliza Bell built it," I said. "I just fixed what she started." Eliza Bell was crazy. Eliza Bell was right. Mrs. Hanley looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. I reckon she was. By March, I was trading. Armloads of dry wood for lamp oil, for flour, for seeds, for nails. The people who came to my door weren't friendly exactly. They still looked at me sideways, still whispered about the crazy woman's burrow, but they needed what I had. Amos Pritchard sent his daughter Ruthie with a flour sack the day after the Glaze storm broke. She was 14, embarrassed, clearly repeating words her father had given her. "Papa says to ask if you can spare any wood for trade. He says he'll give fair value and store credit." "He told me you can't outsmart winter with a shovel." Ruthie blinked. "Ma'am?" "Nothing." I filled the sack. "Tell your papa the credit's not necessary. Tell him it's a gift." She left confused. I didn't care if Amos Pritchard understood or not. I wasn't doing this to prove a point to him. I was doing it because Eliza would have wanted me to. Miss Clara Wren came in April. She was the county school teacher, maybe 30, with ink-stained fingers and a way of looking at things like she was measuring them. She spent 3 hours in and around the trench, asking questions I didn't always know how to answer. "The Earth acts as thermal mass," she said, more to herself than to me. "Below the frost line, soil temperature remains relatively constant regardless of air temperature. The sod roof provides additional insulation while allowing enough moisture to escape that condensation doesn't accumulate, and the interior access means weather conditions above ground are irrelevant to accessibility." She looked up at me. "This is not foolishness. This is design." "I know." "Did you know the principles, or did you learn them from the notebooks?" "Does it matter?" She smiled. "No, I suppose it doesn't." She pulled a pencil and paper from her bag. "May I make some drawings? I'd like to circulate this. Other homesteads could benefit." That's what Eliza wanted. That's what she always wanted. Clara's drawings turned into a one-sheet handbill that she had printed in broken bow. The Bell Trench, earth-sheltered winter fuel storage for the prairie homestead. She credited Eliza Crow Bell as the originator and me as the continuator. I kept a copy of that handbill. I still have it somewhere. Gideon Thale came by in May when the last of the ice had finally melted and the prairie was starting to green up. He didn't come to trade. He came to look. He sat on his horse at the edge of my property for a long time, watching me dig a new section of trench, an extension, following Eliza's notes for a root cellar addition. When he finally rode closer, his face was the same mask of satisfied contempt I remembered from the probate room. "You've got fools digging graves for cordwood," he said. I didn't stop working. "Better a grave in summer than one in January." "You think you're clever." "I think I'm warm. I think I was warm all winter while you and everyone else were chopping ice." I set down my spade and looked at him directly. "I think your hired men came to my door 3 times in February, and I think you know they did." His face went tight. That was their business. It was my business. I gave them wood anyway. "I don't know what you're trying to prove, Mrs. Bell." "I'm not trying to prove anything, Mr. Thale. I'm trying to survive. That's all I've ever been trying to do." I picked up my spade again. "If you're here to buy the place, the answer is no. If you're here to watch me work, you can do that from the road. If you're here for any other reason, I can't imagine what it might be." He looked at me for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he turned his horse and rode away without another word. I watched him go. Then I went back to digging. The summer of '86 was good. The wells held. The rain came when it was supposed to. Crops went in and came out, and nobody thought much about winter because winter was months away and summers on the prairie are for forgetting. I didn't forget. I extended the trench another 12 feet. I built a covered sorting bay outside the main entrance where I could process and stack wood without bringing dirt into the storage area. Silas helped when he could, but his cough had settled into something permanent, and there were weeks when I didn't see him at all. "You worry about me," he said one afternoon, watching me watch him. "Don't. I've been old for a long time. I know what it looks like." "You should rest more." "Rest is for people who've finished their work." He gestured at the trench, the cabin, the land around us. "I want to see this spread. I want to see other folks build what Eliza designed. Then I can rest." By fall, 3 other homesteads had started their own trenches, following Clara's handbill and asking me questions I was starting to know how to answer. The Garrett place, where Silas's son had been walking from 30 years earlier, the Rusk brothers claim, and Mrs. Hanley, who had hired her nephew to dig and was planning to store not just wood, but potatoes, turnips, and carrots. "This is working," Silas said, looking out at the prairie from my doorway. "Eliza's idea. It's spreading. Because of Clara's drawings. Because of you." He coughed, the deep, wet cough that had become as familiar as his voice. "Clara drew it. You built it. You proved it. That's what people needed to see, one winter of proof." The January of '88 began like a gift. Warm days, shirt-sleeve weather, the kind of fall spring that makes you stupid about what's coming. I remember the 12th of that month specifically because I'd gone to town for salt and lamp oil, and the road was dry enough that my wagon didn't stick once. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the world had ended. The wind came first. It swung around from the south to the north so fast you could feel the temperature drop between one breath and the next. Then the sky went from blue to gray to black in the time it took to unhitch a horse. Then the snow came, not falling, but flying sideways, so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. I was inside when it hit, stoking the stove, not thinking about anything more dangerous than what to make for dinner. The first I knew of it was the sound, a roar like a freight train that went on and on without stopping. I opened the door. The cold hit me like a wall. I slammed it shut, my lungs aching from the single breath I'd taken of that air. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. By nightfall, it was the coldest I had ever experienced. By the next morning, it was worse. For 3 days, I didn't leave the cabin. I couldn't have if I'd wanted to. The door was drifted shut by the end of the first night, and I had to wait until the wind died down to dig out. But I had the hatch. I had the trench. Every morning and every evening, I lifted the loose plank and pulled up dry wood and kept the fire burning. When I finally dug out and walked into town 5 days later, I learned what the storm had done. The Hanley boys had lost 2 fingers each to frostbite trying to free their outdoor woodpile. The Rusk brothers had burned their chairs, their table, and half their door trying to stay warm, and they still nearly died. The Petersons had lost their youngest, a baby, 6 months old, who didn't survive the first night. And everywhere I went, I heard the same story. The ice, the impossible ice, that had sealed everything under a shell that couldn't be broken. We tried everything, Amos Pritchard told me, his face gray with exhaustion, and something else. Shame, I think. Axes, picks, hot water. The hot water froze before it could melt the ice. We broke 3 handles, 3. How did you make it through? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I already knew. His daughter had come to my door with a flour sack months earlier. His hired men had come during the Glaze storm. Word had spread about the widow in the borough who had dry wood when no one else did. They had come to me. All of them. 1 family at a time, then 2 at a time, then more than I could count. The first person to come during the blizzard was Ruthie Pritchard. She arrived on the morning of the 3rd day, when the wind had died enough to walk, but the drifts were still shoulder-high in places. She was shaking so badly she could barely stand, her eyelashes frozen, her lips blue. "Papa sent me," she said through chattering teeth. "He said to ask if you have anything at all, just enough to start a fire, just enough to get through until we can dig out our own." I looked at her, 14 years old, standing in my doorway, freezing, sent by a father who had called Eliza a dirt-counting heathen. "Come inside," I said. I sat her by the stove and gave her hot water with a little sugar in it. While she warmed up, I lifted the hatch and climbed down into the trench with a lantern. I counted my rows, counted what I had, counted what I'd need to get through the rest of the winter if nobody else came. Then I filled a flour sack with as much as Ruthie could carry. "I can't pay," she said when I handed it to her. "Papa said to tell you we'll pay in spring, but I don't know if you don't have to pay." "But, Ruthie," I knelt down so I was eye level with her. "Tell your papa the wood is free. Tell him Eliza Bell would have given it the same way. Tell him," I paused. "Tell him fire doesn't ask who mocked you before it warms them." She left. 3 hours later, her father showed up with a sledge to haul a larger load. He didn't look at me when he came to the door. He didn't apologize. But he took the wood I offered, and before he left, he said 2 words. "Thank you." It was the closest to human he had ever sounded in my presence. They came for 8 days straight. Mrs. Hanley was next, then the Garrett family, then people I'd never met from homesteads I'd never heard of. Word had spread through the valley faster than the cold. The widow in Bell's Burrow had fuel, and she was giving it away. I didn't keep count of how many families came. I didn't keep count of how many armloads I pulled from the trench, how many flour sacks I filled, how many sledges and wagons left my property loaded with wood. I just kept climbing down the ladder, kept pulling logs from the rows, kept handing them to whoever showed up at my door. The Petersons came on the 5th day, the family who had lost the baby. The mother couldn't stop crying. The father stood in my doorway with his hat in his hands and didn't say a word. I gave them twice as much as I gave anyone else, and when Mrs. Peterson tried to thank me, I just shook my head. "I'm sorry about your little one," I said. "I'm so sorry." She hugged me. I don't know why. I hadn't saved her baby. I couldn't save anyone from what had already happened. But she hugged me anyway, and I hugged her back, and we stood there in my doorway while the cold wind blew and the world turned white. Gideon Thales sent his men again. Not himself, he was too proud for that. But his men came twice, asking for fuel for the bunkhouse. I gave it to them. They didn't thank me either. Silas came on the 4th day, wrapped in every coat he owned, riding his old mule Ruth through drifts that came up past her belly. "You're giving it all away," he said, looking at the parade of sledges in my yard. That's what it's for. You'll have nothing left. I looked at him. This old man who had taught me everything Eliza's notebooks couldn't, who had spent his last good months helping me build something he would barely live to see. They don't deserve it, you know, he said quietly. Most of them laughed. Most of them called her crazy. Called you crazy. I know. And you're helping them anyway. I thought about Ruthie Pritchard's frozen eyelashes. I thought about the Peterson baby who didn't survive the first night. I thought about Silas's son, 50 yards from home, frozen in a spring storm 30 years ago. Because fire doesn't ask who mocked you before it warms them, I said. Because they're cold. Because I can help. Because that's what Eliza would have done. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. She would have, he said. She absolutely would have. By the time the cold broke, I had given away nearly 2/3 of my supply. The trench that had held 3 full cords now held barely 1. It would be enough to get me through the rest of the winter, barely. But there was nothing left for emergencies, nothing left for next year until I could cut and haul more. I didn't regret it, not for a single moment. The thaw came slowly, the way it always does after the worst storms. First the wind died. Then the sun came back, pale and weak but persistent. Then the ice started to crack and run and finally disappear, revealing the broken axes and the ruined woodpiles and the damage that the cold had done. The county paper called it the worst blizzard in Nebraska history. They said hundreds had died across the territory, many of them children caught at school when the storm hit without warning. They called it the children's blizzard. In Juniper Crossing, nobody died after the first night. Not one. Clara Wren wrote another article, this one for a farm circular out of Lincoln. Earth-Sheltered Storage and the Blizzard of 1888, One Valley's Survival. She named me. She named Eliza. She described the trench system in detail and explained the principle of thermal mass and protected access. 3 months later, I received a letter from a professor at the State Agricultural College asking if he could visit. He came in May, measured everything, took photographs, and wrote a report that I never read but that apparently made its way into the hands of people who cared about such things. But none of that mattered as much as what happened in late February, 3 weeks after the blizzard broke, when Mrs. Hester Vane appeared at my door. I didn't recognize her at first. The last time I'd seen her, she'd been standing in the probate room with her steel gray bun and her permanent expression of mild disgust, telling me that even the dead could play cruel jokes on the living. The woman at my door was smaller than I remembered. Older. Her bun had come loose on one side, and there was snow on her coat that she hadn't bothered to brush off. "Mrs. Bell," she said. Not Nettie, not girl. Mrs. Bell. "Mrs. Vane. May I come in?" I stepped aside. She walked past me, looked around the cabin, and stood in the middle of the room without speaking. Her eyes found the hatch in the floor. She stared at it for a long time. "The church women sent me," she said finally. "We're organizing fuel distribution for families who still need help. I thought that you might be willing to coordinate. You want me to coordinate fuel distribution. You have experience, you have knowledge, you have—" She stopped. "You have what we need." I didn't say anything. I just waited. Mrs. Vane looked at me. Then she looked away. Her hands were shaking, and I don't think it was from the cold. "I was wrong," she said. "About what?" "About you. About this place. About—" Her voice broke. She pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, then lowered it. "About Eliza Bell." I still didn't speak. I wanted to hear her say it. "She wrote to me," Mrs. Vane continued. "Twice. Maybe more. She asked if there were any girls at Mercy House who liked numbers or books. Girls who might benefit from practical instruction. Girls who—" She closed her eyes. "Girls like you." The room was very quiet. Outside I could hear the wind, distant and soft. "I threw the letters in the stove," Mrs. Vane said. "I told myself I was protecting the girls. I told myself no child should be sent to a woman who buried household goods in ditches. I told myself it was my duty." She opened her eyes. I was a fool. I thought about what my life might have been. 8 years old, motherless, fatherless, sent to a woman who understood systems and measurements and the precise depth at which soil temperature stabilizes. 8 years of learning, 8 years of companionship, 8 years of being wanted by someone who saw what I was before I knew it myself. All of it burned to ash in Mrs. Vane's stove. I forgive you, I said. She looked up, surprised. Not because you deserve it, I continued. You don't. What you took from me, what you took from Eliza, there's no making that right. But I forgive you because I will not spend one more winter carrying you inside me. I took a breath. The fuel distribution. Tell the church women I'll help. Mrs. Vane nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but nothing came out. She walked to the door, opened it, and paused on the threshold. Eliza Bell was not crazy, she said quietly. I know that now. I wish I had known it then. So do I. She left. I watched her walk away through the snow, her shoulders hunched, her steps uncertain. Then I closed the door and sat down by the stove and cried. Silas died the following winter. I found him in his chair by the fire, boots still on, a bowl of bean broth cooling on the table beside him. He looked peaceful, tired, but peaceful, like he'd finally gotten the rest he'd been putting off for years. I buried him on the rise behind his cabin, where you could see the whole valley spread out below. The ground was frozen, and it took me 2 days to dig deep enough. But I did it myself because that's what he would have wanted. I planted wild plum on his grave. He'd mentioned once that his wife used to make plum preserves before she passed. It seemed right. His will left me his tool chest, his mule Ruth, and a folded note that said only, make them build it right or not at all. I kept all of it. The tools are in my granddaughter's barn now. Ruth lived another 8 years and was the most stubborn animal I ever knew, which seems fitting. By the time Silas died, 7 families in the county had built their own trench systems. By the time I turned 30, that number was closer to 40. Clara Wren's handbill had spread beyond the county, beyond the territory, into Kansas and the Dakotas, and anywhere else the winters came hard and the wood came dear. I married in 1900, 3 years after the new century began. Thomas Wren was Clara's brother-in-law, a carpenter who had moved west to help his brother with a building contract and never left. He was a quiet man who listened more than he talked, and never once laughed at anything I said about storage temperatures or drainage slopes. We had 3 children. They grew up knowing how to build a trench the way other children knew how to milk a cow or harness a horse. It was just part of life. The years passed the way years do when you're working. Spring, summer, fall, winter, planting and harvesting and preparing and surviving and doing it all again. My hands changed. They stopped feeling like a girl's hands somewhere around my 25th year. And by my 40th, they were as rough and thick-knuckled as Silas's had been. My back learned the shape of a spade handle. My knees learned the dimensions of the trench. The county agent started calling it Bell Trench Storage in his winter preparedness talks. I tried to correct him once, told him it should be Eliza Bell's Trench Storage. But the name had already stuck. People remembered what they remembered. At least they remembered something. I died on a Thursday afternoon in March of 1942. Spring had come early that year, the way it sometimes does in Nebraska, and I'd spent the morning in the garden, turning soil, preparing beds, doing the things I'd done every spring for 57 years. My daughter found me sitting on the cabin threshold with a split stick across my lap and dirt on my thumb. She said later that I looked like I'd just paused in the middle of explaining something, like I was waiting for someone to catch up. She wasn't wrong. Eliza's notebooks are in a glass case at the Nebraska State Historical Society now. Book 11, the one with the letters and the note to the first stubborn girl, is open to that last page. People come to look at it sometimes. Mostly they don't understand what they're seeing. They think it's about wood storage. It isn't. It's about a woman who spent 26 years solving a problem that everyone around her said didn't need solving. It's about a girl who inherited that solution when she had nothing else, who rebuilt it with bleeding hands and stubborn patience, who gave it away to people who had mocked her because that's what the solution was for. It's about reach, I think about that probate room sometimes. The mud on the floor, the men on the benches, Mrs. Vane's tight gray bun, and her voice, sharp and satisfied, saying, "Even the dead can leave a girl one final humiliation." She was wrong, not just wrong about the inheritance, wrong about everything. The dead left me a gift. The gift was knowledge. The knowledge kept me alive. And when the worst winter in Nebraska history came to take everything from everyone, the gift kept my neighbors alive too. Eliza's words are carved in stone now, on a small marker at the edge of what used to be my property. Winter does not beat you by cold alone. It beats you by taking away your reach. She was right. She was right about all of it. And I was the stubborn girl who came after her, just like she hoped. So let me ask you something. What trench are you standing beside right now? What useful thing have you been told is worthless? What plain, humble, unglamorous work have you been putting off because somebody laughed at the idea? Maybe it's a piece of land. Maybe it's a skill nobody values. Maybe it's a plan you've been turning over in your mind for years, waiting for the right time, waiting for permission, waiting for someone to tell you it's not crazy. Maybe it's something smaller, a habit you need to build, a relationship you need to repair, a hard conversation you've been avoiding because you know what it will cost. Winter is coming. It's always coming. Not the winter of snow and ice, though that comes too, but the winter of crisis, of pressure, of finding out what you've built and whether it holds. When that winter comes, what will you be able to reach? The trench doesn't look like much when it's empty. It looks like a ditch. It looks like foolishness. It looks like a lot of hard work for uncertain reward. But when the ice seals everything else shut, when the wind strips away every comfort, when you're standing in the cold wondering how you're going to survive, that's when the trench matters. That's when reach matters. Eliza Bell spent 26 years building something the world didn't understand. I spent one winter proving the world wrong. And all these years later, the idea she planted in frozen Nebraska soil is still spreading, still protecting people, still giving reach to anyone stubborn enough to dig. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own buried gifts, your own sealed hatches, your own 30 acres of what everyone calls worthless, then subscribe to this channel for more stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary lives from the nothing they were given. And then go do something with what you've got. Your trench is not a grave. It is your reach. Build it before the weather turns.